Hey there, I'm Alex Kidman and this is the Oppo Reno13 5G. Let's get into the review. But before we start, I should point out that this phone was loaned to me by Oppo Australia. It's going back to them. That's why it's still got the ugly sticker on the back. I point this out just because I think ethical disclosure really is an important thing that's left off way too many YouTube video reviews, but now we can get on with the actual review. The Oppo Reno13 is built around a 6.59-inch AMOLED 120Hz capable display with a resolution of 1256 by 2760, entirely appropriate for this price range. The front-facing camera sits in a standard hole puncher at the top middle, and honestly, from the front, this looks about as generic as any standard smartphone at this size does. Flip it around, however, and the magic happens, because the Reno13 really is a nice-looking phone. I often rail against the silly prefixes that phone makers drop onto the colour choices for their phones, your superb, your wonderful, your amazings, and things like that. But here, at least for the model they supplied to me in luminous blue, Oppo's actually just being descriptive. The camera bump on the back is ringed in light blue and is very cleverly constructed to give it a shining halo effect in most light situations. Honestly, at first I thought Oppo was wasting battery power here by lighting this thing up, until I realised no, that's actually just really clever reflection. It's a subtle effect, but it's quite gorgeous actually. I really rather like it, although I suppose I should note that I am a bit of a sucker for blue phones. Your own tastes may vary. Now, internationally it appears that Oppo produces the Reno13 in a variety of colours. Here in Australia we just get the luminous blue or plume white. I'm presuming the plume white doesn't attract peacocks, but I guess I can't rule it out. Controls on the Reno13 sit on the right hand side with your standard volume and digital assistant power button combination. Unlocking is biometric with an in-display fingerprint sensor that's given me no grief during my review period. The Reno13 supports dual nano SIM, but does not support microSD expansion, plus eSIM. Again, that's totally in line with what I'd expect at this price point. I would also expect to perhaps see some level of advanced water resistance, and here, Oppo once again steps up to the plate and then some. The Reno13 is rated at IP69, which means it's resistant against quite powerful water jets as well as immersion. Now, that's not carte blanche to start living the Aquaman life with this phone. I've got a full video on water resistance and why that's not the same thing as waterproof, if you want to go check that out. But it's nice to see such a strong level of water resistance in a phone that costs less than $1,000 here in Australia. In camera terms, the Reno13 sits in an interesting space. It's obviously above the Reno13 F I've already reviewed, but it's below the Reno13 Pro and phones like the Find X8 Pro, for example. What you get specifically is a 50 megapixel wide sensor, 8 megapixel ultra wide sensor, and 2 megapixel monochrome sensor. That monochrome sensor is not used for shooting black and whites, it's just a depth sensor basically. And at the front, you get a 50 megapixel sensor for your selfies. The Reno13's general camera performance is, look, it's honestly fair with its price range. Obviously, telephoto is missing, that's on the Pro model, though Oppo's camera app does provide up to 20 times digital hybrid zoom, although predictably the results do get worse the more you push it. I'll give you an example here. While I was out on a camera testing walk with the Reno13, I spotted a nearby spider on a leaf. Now, I should point out, I'm not a big fan of spiders, to put it mildly, so I wasn't that keen to get that close, even though this was quite a small spider, but it provided a good way to put the Reno13 zoom to the test. The standard shot is fine, it's daytime, I'd totally expect that. And even the 5 times shot actually holds up pretty well, but push it to 20 times, yeah, no, it falls apart. And yes, I'm zooming in on a very small area, but equally, 20 times anything just looks blocky and awful. Don't push it, because basically you can't. That being said, overall, this is a decent camera within its price range. The typical caveats kind of apply. Super low light or really fast action is not exactly its forte. You still have to spend a little bit more. But overall, yeah, I quite like the camera on this phone. In hardware terms, the Reno13 is built around a MediaTek 8350 processor with, at least for the Australian model tested, 256GB of fixed onboard storage and 12GB of RAM. Now, I would have preferred microSD expansion, as I usually do, but 256GB at the Oppo Reno13's $899 asking price is a pretty decent deal. A lot of competing handsets at this kind of price, you're looking at 128 gig of onboard storage and maybe only 8 gig of RAM as well. It is interesting to note that Oppo uses the exact same chipset in the Reno13 Pro, but if you step down to the Reno13 F, you're looking at a Snapdragon 6 Gen 1 chipset. Of course, the more relevant comparison here is with phones in or around the Reno13's price point, because if you're spending $899 on a phone, you're solidly in that upper tier of mid-range phones, and it always makes sense to get the best device for your money. So how does the Reno13 compare? Here's how it stacks up against similarly priced handsets using Geekbench 6's CPU test. The Reno13 is beat out by Samsung's top-tier mid-range phone and Apple's lowest-priced iPhone, though both do cost a little more than Oppo's effort here. It's not the best in class, but it's certainly reasonable at this price point. And while the Pixel 9a is due out quite soon, relative to when I'm recording this video, I've not yet been able to test that device, though my expectations based on what the Pixel 9 does suggest it's not likely to jump up in performance terms all that much over the Pixel 8a. On the GPU front, here's how the Reno13 compares against that same suite of phones. The practical reality of using the Reno13 day-to-day with a variety of apps is that, while it's not in the premium space or priced as such, most Android apps will run well enough, as long as you don't expect to be pushing the edges of higher-tier Android games or similar heavy data crunching apps at the highest level. The Oppo Reno13 runs Android 15 with Oppo's own ColorOS overlay on top of it. ColorOS is, as it's always been, a substantial rewrite of much of what Android does. And yes, it's got its fans. These days, I'm kind of on the fence about it. Honestly, I'd prefer a more plain Android look and feel, and I don't love having to dig around for certain settings to get moved around, seemingly just for the sake of it. But I can see the simplistic appeal here. It's a very bright interface. It's got still a certain quantity of iOS aping DNA in there, because ColorOS, way back in the day, used to be a pretty blatant iOS clone. It has its fans, it's fine, it's there, it works well enough. Oppo provides also a whole bunch of its own apps for common Android functions. With full disclosure, I barely use those. I have my own suite of Android apps that I would prefer to use. And you do have full Google Play here, so you can install most apps anyway. You, of course, don't only have Google Play, you also have Oppo's app market. And while I appreciate the idea of expanded consumer choice and where you get your apps, App Market remains a poor cousin to Google Play. The first time you launch it, it'll try to get you to install a number of apps you may or may not want, and it's a little tricky in how it hides the skip button a bit there. And it's notable that a lot of app searches in the App Market just return a number of Google Play Store results, at which point you kind of may as well be using Google Play anyway. Speaking of less than useful apps, the Oppo Reno13 also installs a number of them by default, including the same apps that many phone makers shove onto phones, whether you want them or not. So we're talking your typical culprits here. Booking.com, Temu, WPS Office, and a range of very bland Android games. Now, you can uninstall all of them. I would suggest that you do. I just kind of wish that they weren't there. I know where they are. Money changes hands, but a clean Android phone is always just that bit nicer. I'd rather put my apps onto my phone if it's all the same to you. And that's an argument I can make with a bunch of different phone makers, not just Oppo, but Oppo's put a lot of bloatware here. The Oppo Reno13 is, strictly speaking, the Reno13 5G, so it's capable of running on both 4G and 5G networks here in Australia, and potentially lower-scale 2G and 3G networks overseas. It's a sub-6 GHz phone, and it's performed basically the same as most sub-6 GHz phones have in my tests, which use the Telstra network here in Sydney. Hits about 200 to 400 meg down. Your experiences may vary, but I've genuinely had no real problems with it in terms of data or reception for that matter. It feels like the period where I complain that every single Android phone ships with a 5,000 mAh battery while insisting it's a huge battery might be coming to an end. Because the Oppo Reno13 is yet another handset that opts for a slightly larger battery than that standard metric. It's packing in a 5,600 mAh battery to be precise. Now, battery life, of course, can be highly variable. Totally depends on how you use it, of course. I've got a whole video on battery life tests and what your expectations should be. Please go and check that out once you've finished watching this review. But to give it some comparative weighting, I ran the Reno13 through my standard YouTube 3-hour battery test. Here's how it compares. The Reno13 performs well in that test, and it does match up with my more anecdotal observations of its battery life. Sure, you could send it flat in a day if you use it intensively for video recording or playing a whole bunch of higher-end games, but for most everyday users, a day, yeah, that's no real problem. You should be able to get through a standard working day quite easily without needing to reach for a charger. And speaking of chargers, the Reno 13 is one of a rare breed in its price space, partly because it doesn't support wireless charging, which I don't love, but mostly because you do get a physical charger in the box. Specifically, it's one of Oppo's 80-watt SuperVOOC chargers, along with a USB-A to USB-C cable to use while charging up the Reno 13. The Reno 13, because this question does come up from time to time, will work with other USB-C chargers, it just probably won't charge as fast. That SuperVOOC charger though, and this is more experience born of years of testing, they can sometimes be a bit fussy charging other gadgets. It's something to do with the SuperVOOC standard that some gadgets I've plugged into just say, no, I'm not plugging into a charger at all, which is safe of course, but it doesn't get you the charging that you want. So should you buy the Oppo Reno 13? Well look, there's a lot of really interesting phones that can be yours in that upper tier, kind of between about $750 to $1,100 Australian price bracket. The Reno 13 sits nicely within that price space. Sure, it could be a little more powerful in pure grunt terms, but it serves its price bracket well with decent cameras, great battery life, and a really stunning design that I really do quite like a lot. I'll always advocate for the idea that everyone should shop around when buying a phone at any price point. But if your budget works within this space, the Oppo Reno 13 is well worth your consideration.